Good afternoon, everybody. We'll just give attendees a couple more minutes to open the webinar, and then we'll start. So there are still people joining, but I suggest we make a start, since we're already at 118 participants and climbing, which is a sign of the interest in today's webinar. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Plowden. I'm the chair of the Transport Planning Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, which is jointly sponsored by the TPS, the Academy of Urbanism, and the CIHT. And we're meeting today to mark the 60th anniversary of the Buchanan Report, Traffic in Towns, which was published almost exactly 60 years ago, November 1963, for the UK Ministry of Transport, as it was then known. And as the number of people joining the call suggests, it was a hugely influential and prescient report addressing all the issues around how to manage the issue of traffic in towns at the beginning of the motor age in the early 60s, at the start of the era of mass car ownership and mass car use. And I just thought it'd be worth quoting very briefly from Colin Buchanan himself, who said at around the time of the report, "It is impossible to spend any time on the study of the future of traffic in towns without at once being appalled by the magnitude of the emergency that is coming upon us. We are nourishing at immense cost a monster of great potential destructiveness, and yet we love him dearly." Him, notice. To refuse to accept the challenge it presents would be an act of defeatism. So what we're going to do today, and thank you very much to Peter Jones, who'll be presenting in a minute, for suggesting this webinar, is have a look back at the Buchanan report, what it was intended to do, what it said, what it recommended, what it foresaw. Look back at it in retrospect with a couple of presentations from Andreas and Athol. I'll introduce them in a minute. And then look forward whether or not and in what way the Buchanan report is still relevant today, both in a UK domestic setting from Glasgow and then globally from Isabel Dedring from Arup. So we've got 5 very distinguished speakers to help us do that. First of all, we're going to hear from Peter Jones from UCL, who will just give us a brief update of the report itself, what it was intended to do, what it said, what it forecast. Then we'll have 2 presentations from Andreas Marquides and Athol Noon from Marquides Associates, who will essentially make the case very crudely for and against, I think it's fair to say, the report, looking back in retrospect. Then we'll take a few minutes for questions in either the chat or the Q&A function from people on the call. And then we'll have a forward look, firstly from Deborah Patton from Glasgow City Council, and then finally a more global perspective from Isabel Dedring from Arup. And it's worth saying that the debate that raised at the time of the Buchanan report is still with us today. The debate about low traffic neighbourhoods, around the recent extension of the ultra low emission zone in London, and numerous reports on the merits of road pricing, the debate in Cambridgeshire about their congestion charging scheme. This debate around the role of traffic in towns and how we manage it is absolutely with us today. So let's start with Peter Jones from UCL, giving us a historical perspective on the report, what it was intended to do and what it foresaw. Peter,
thanks very much, Ben. So basically, as Ben said, the report was commissioned by the Ministry of Transport in 1961 to look at the long-term problems of traffic in towns in the light of the rapid increases in car ownership and use. And it was fairly unique in that it brought together land use planning and traffic engineering perspectives and had a very strong architectural content as well. And these were some of the key messages: that car ownership and car use will grow rapidly for several decades. Doing nothing would lead to huge environmental issues and worsening traffic congestion. But accommodating those demands fully would require major road infrastructure and land use changes. If we don't fully meet the anticipated future growth in car use, then we will need good public transport alternatives and forms of traffic restraint. And interestingly, there are a few references to pedestrians or cyclists. The report is over 200 pages, so I'm just going to pick out a few things to share with you, except my thing is now stuck, which is always very helpful. Right, sorry about that. It does that sometimes. There we go. Right. The first thing to say actually is that back in the early 1960s, it made forecasts of growth in car ownership, and they were remarkably good. The central estimate from Buchanan was that by 2010 there will be 30 million cars in the UK, and in fact in 2010 we had 30.3 million. I'm not sure our subsequent forecasts were as good. As Ben alluded to, with our low traffic neighbourhoods now, then effectively at that time, that was also recognised as a problem, rat running and so on. So he proposed environmental areas to exclude through traffic, very similar to our traffic filters now. In the process also, he, in common with the more scientific thinking that started to permeate at that time and systems objective thinking, said we need a hierarchy of roads with different speeds, different capacities, and from the primary and secondary roads, no direct access from frontages, limited access from local distributors, and primarily all the activity within what he called environmental areas, only dealing effectively almost like within low traffic neighbourhoods. He looked at 4 places, Newbury, London, Norwich and Leeds, and talked about what might be needed if we were going to accommodate the car to various degrees. On the left-hand side, you've got a complete rebuild of Newbury in order to accommodate as much car use as would be desired, completely rebuilding a ring road around the centre there and good links onto a nearby motorway. On the right-hand side was a more restricted network of what might be more practical, more or less conserving the existing structure of the urban area, but providing some access by car to the area. And here's an example on the ground, very similar to the example I just showed in Newbury, was Southend, where on the right-hand side of the town centre, they put this north-south distributor road, 2 lanes in each direction. And you can see quite a bit of severance there, not very easy to cross. And in fact, just up the road there in the background on the left-hand side is a big roundabout where there is no surface crossing. There are pedestrian underpasses, but as you can see, people don't feel very comfortable or safe using those. So they are actually moving around at surface levels in a rather dangerous way. This is one of the slides that I think one of the iconic slides from the Buchanan report, which often gets quoted, which was looking at Fitzrovia, and I think this might have been Tottenham Court Road, basically saying if we wanted to accommodate maximum car use, we would have to rebuild our cities at several levels, and particularly have pedestrian walking above the street level. We can see that in the Barbican in the City of London. But I think Buchanan wasn't necessarily saying this is what we should do. I think he was saying this is what it would entail if we really wanted to make the car king. So that was just a very brief introduction for me, just to sort of set the scene. I'll hand back to you, Ben. Thank you.
And Peter, just one question for me. If the Buchanan report had been a PhD thesis submitted to you at UCL, how would you have graded it? Would you think? I mean, what sort of score would you have given it in terms of its content and its foresight and its addressing of the issue at the time?
Well, had it been submitted to a transport and architectural department, I think it would have got very high marks. Different disciplines tend to weight things differently, but I think the beauty of this is it was quite strong on the traffic engineering and the transport side, but also very strong on the land use planning and architectural side, which makes it fairly unique, actually. So overall, I'd rate it very highly. And clearly, it's been influential. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So, Peter, thank you very much for that historical perspective on the report, what it was designed to do and what it suggested might happen. So we now come to Andreas Marquides and Athol Noon, who are very crudely going to sort of put the case for and against. I think that's a fair summary, the Buchanan report. Starting with Andreas, who will talk about the sort of what was good about the report, and then I think Athol may raise some questions around what may have been less good about it, and what we might want to think about now as we think about these issues in the 21st century. So Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. And before starting, can I just praise Peter's answer to your question? Because I should let people know that Sir Colin Buchanan was a polymath. He was he was an engineer and an architect and a planner at the same time, something which I sometimes think is lacking from our expert-orientated societies of today. Peter's answer is even more praiseworthy because Professor Colin Buchanan was professor at Imperial College rather than UCL, which is Peter's university. Okay, I'm going, as Ben said, I'm going to focus mainly on the pluses of the report. I should say that I may be a little bit biased in critiquing the report because I had the great pleasure and privilege of working with Sir Colin's consultancy, Colin Buchanan and Partners, for 22 years. And I met him, and he was a real gentleman. But I find it no hardship in praising the report because it was truly excellent and pioneering at the time. There can be no better illustration of that fact than the fact that it was published by Penguin because it was so well written and accessible to the everyday reader. It wasn't just a technical report, it just spoke in very good English about the question that it was set. So, next slide, please, Athol. As has already been said, this is, in preparation of this webinar, I flicked through his report a couple of weekends ago, and I was astounded by how prophetic that report was. And this is a sentence from that report from page 1. All indicators are that the motor vehicle will wreck our town within a decade. So it was prophetic and very, very far-sighted. In fact, as I was flicking through the pages, I started to think, my God, have we learned nothing from 60 years ago? Because we are still talking about the same topics and making the same mistakes since then. Next, please. So what are the issues that were raised by the report? It focused on the fact that everything we did was disposed towards accommodating the car. And it spoke about the sprawl, the urban sprawl that we were creating as opposed to the compact communities that we're trying to build now. It spoke about the encroachment of cars onto the footways, the dreary and formless car parks, and highway works that were violating the environment. All these words are the words that we use nowadays in considering new developments and the impact of car on our communities. So the report went on to say, okay, with all this mess that is being created, what should we tackle? Next, please. And it spoke about we need to reduce traffic accidents, we need to reduce fumes and smell, traffic noise, signs clutter. I just find it amazing, you know, my profession as a transport planner and an engineer, these are the things that we are still battling with today. Next, please. The key messages from the report are again messages that are as current as they were in the 60s. It spoke about an integrated approach. How many times have we said that in the last few years? We keep talking about it, but unfortunately, we remain within our silos. The engineers do their own thing, and the planners do their own thing, and the urban designers do their own thing. It's amazing that we have recognized that. We speak about an integrated approach, but we do not dare break the silos. He spoke about land use planning. Land use planning, which is what I suppose gave rise to the zonal planning systems that we come across in many parts of the world now. And significantly, he rang the bell about the environment. He spoke about creating environmental areas. It was the very first time really that and he had a graph which compared accessibility and the environment. It was inversely proportional, and it was down to us to decide where we wanted to put the dot. Was it accessibility or environment? And with regards to the environment, again, he spoke about the need to set environmental standards. Have we got environmental standards these days? We keep saying that we need to have these standards, but we don't really have that many. We continue to rely on traffic modeling and quantification of impacts such as delays and queue lengths, rather than the impact on the environment. We do not have any quantification of the environmental impacts, which is why we tend to do the wrong thing, because we focus on traffic rather than the bigger picture. And he made the point that streets are not just for cars, they are far more than that. They're for people. That was a pioneering statement at the time. So what is the legacy of that report and of Sir Collins' work? The first one is the awareness about the environmental impact. He couldn't have stressed that any more. He spoke about the need to prepare multimodal assessments. I have to say that the people that followed that report have either ignored the recommendations or misinterpreted what was said. The report spoke about the need for multimodal solutions, and we have spent the last 50, 60 years focusing on highways. It was always about how can we build more highways, when it was always, the recommendation was always about the need for multimodal solutions. It spoke about the vigilance of handling planning applications. The report itself is what really gave rise to development control departments within different councils. And he spoke again about the need to define accessibility and the environment. Next, please. So what are the tangible illustrations of that report? Well, the first one is very obvious. It spoke about the motor car taking over our lives, huge traffic growth. It has happened. It also spoke for the first time the need to look at how we evaluate different schemes. And the older members amongst you will remember the COBA methodology, which was really primarily about the time it took a car to go from X to Y. The Traffic in Towns report actually said, look, if we're going to do cost-benefit analysis, we need to look at all the other impacts on the environment, on the noise, on the health, etc., etc. And dare I say, we didn't really start to do that until very, very recently. And in fact, Crossrail will never have been approved as a meaningful transport scheme unless we had moved away from the rigid COBA methodology and we started to look at the other benefits that Crossrail would bring. um, the idea for civilized neighborhoods, home zones, is what gave us the Dutch Woonerf. Not many people see this connection, but it was a very linear jump from the 60s to the 70s when the Dutch introduced the Woonerf idea, based on the recommendation in the book for more civilized neighborhoods. It also spoke about the need for ring roads and multi-story car parks in order to stop traffic from going into the town centers. Again, I think we have misused that recommendation, because we have built multi-story car parks, but we have not taken any notice of how we design those structures. A lot of them are just ugly structures. And the report speaks about the need for good design. And finally, bypasses. The report identified that there is a lot of through traffic in many places, and how can you get rid of it? Through bypasses. But it made the point that bypasses are not the answer to everything. And in fact, it identified that in big urban areas, the level of through traffic compared to the total traffic is very small. And in those cases, you don't need a bypass. In smaller places, historic towns, for example, like the example that Newbury, Peter has already spoken about, the report identified a bypass, and actually we built that bypass in the 80s. Newbury has got a bypass that is absolutely on the same line as the Traffic in Towns report. Some of you may remember the troubles with Swampy, who chained himself under the route of the bypass to stop it from happening. But anyway, that's now been built. So the report made desperate calls for new environmental standards. It made a call for professionals to work together rather than in their separate silos. And it rang the bell and said it will be within our ability to ruin this island by the end of the century if we do not do anything about the car. I think that's me done. Over to you, Arthur.
Thanks, Andreas. That's very helpful. Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending today. But basically, Sir Colin Buchanan was an amazing man, and he and his fantastic team have played a major part in planning in the UK and overseas since the time of this report. But I'm kind of not here to really just solely to sing their praises. My task is to challenge aspects of their study and think how it could have been applied differently. And on the screen, actually, it's a bit of a story, really. But that book there was Sir Colin's own self-published book before Traffic in Towns. So on his own initiative, he decided to try and tackle this problem and wrote this book all on his own. And when the minister was seeking to appoint a commission to look into the cars, the only book they could find in the UK that had anything to do with it was this book. And so this is the precursor of Traffic in Towns, and that's how Sir Colin got the job, effectively to lead a team to look into it. So basically, the context of the report is very important. Britain was riding the wave of a major new technology, the motor vehicle, which created a social and economic revolution. And if you think about a smartphone as we think of it now, the motor vehicle was far more important. It was changing the physical nature of places as well as the way people worked and lived and everything about their lives. And motor vehicles had become indispensable, ranging from cars to freight to buses and to people employed in making and looking after cars and motor vehicles. So it's no surprise that the team's starting point was that it was the desire of society to use the motor vehicle to the full if they could. And so they started with this as their kind of starting point, and then explored the consequences in different types of urban area. And one of their big questions was, how far could or should society be prepared to go to cater for the motor vehicle? But they also had an overriding vision, which is really a good one, which is to say we all need towns worth living in their broadest context, the environmental context, the social context, and everything else. So it's definitely not just about motor vehicles. Their approach was pretty logical and clear. That they set environmental areas where they felt that traffic was a major problem and should be kept sacrosanct where possible. And they then worked outwards to design a highway network. And they emphasize the fact that vehicles on highways are there to service people and land users and not the other way around. And then decided, well, the first cases of decide and provide really was decide on what demand you can cater for given those constraints, and then seek to adjust your demand using various techniques. But they made it very clear that they saw adjusting demand as very politically sensitive and very hard to do. But with this clear approach, I suppose when you look at the case studies, which I'm about to show you, the impression that you do get is that vehicle access dominates. And one of their rules was, if you want vehicle accessibility, you spend more, and you can achieve that, which I think is probably a little bit too far that they took that. So moving on to a couple of case studies. They started off in what they call a small town, which is Newbury. And as Peter showed, they then explored different options of how to, sorry, I've just gone one slide too far, of how to achieve they wanted to protect the center of Newbury, but they explored options from full infrastructure to minimal infrastructure on the right of how they could achieve that. They concluded that a town the size of Newbury, you could provide in full for the car and still protect the environment, but you needed a significant road network, as you can see, and redevelopment for parking, I think, which is shown in the black. But I guess I look at it with hindsight and think, well, what kind of town would Newbury have become if that had really been the final outcome? In relation to the more minimal approach on the right-hand side, they actually thought that would be the worst of both worlds. You'd end up with the congestion and environmental degradation of the place and not really achieve much. So they were not really in favor of a very light touch approach. They didn't see that would achieve what they really set out to achieve. The next place they looked at was Norwich, an historic city. And there, the solution really was relatively clear and seemed sensible. So they said, look, there's no ways you can cater for the car in central Norwich. You need to close it off to vehicles, no through routes, create a massive environmental area where you can protect the center and where people can walk around really freely. But you did need some infrastructure on the outskirts and car parking to actually create that. But on the whole, that's a model that's been followed to a large extent in places like York and others cities, which have managed to protect their historic centers. The next place I looked at was what they called a large town or stroke city of Leeds. And there, the clear conclusion they came to was you could not achieve the full vehicle potential. You had to curtail demand. And in a large part, they foresaw that would be you curtailing the journey to work by car and making sure that was by public transport. But even so, you look at that picture of the possible outcome, and you think that still very, very big major development is required for parking and access. But they also emphasize you needed traffic management. In places like Headingley, you had to actually stop rat running. You had to make sure that you actually dealt with these issues. But I think that actually this is quite a big set of infrastructure and to make it work. And I look at it again with hindsight and think, you could use that famous expression of there's a major in Vietnam, the US Army, who said, I had to destroy the town to save it. And in a way, you could look at that and think that that's a similar conclusion. As Peter mentioned, one of the next items they looked at was a London city block around Tottenham Court Road. And there they said that there's no way you can cater for the car, but even to cater for it in a reasonable extent, and they were talking 50% of the demand, you would probably need a major redevelopment and quite clever use of multi-layers to actually result in a pedestrian environment, but also a level of car access. I did look back and thought, why didn't they show a pedestrianised Oxford Street? without that level of infrastructure, because they clearly talk in the traffic in towns about the huge potential for pedestrian streets. And I always thought that if they'd shown a pedestrianised Oxford Street and talked about that consequences, that would have been a useful addition to the options they showed. And in the end, Tottenham Court Road has not seen this redevelopment. Is it so bad? In fact, we've taken away road capacity, and the street environment now is very good. There are very few vehicles on Tottenham Court Road, but that's largely because somebody's taken the initiative to say, and that comes down through mayoral intervention and GLA and TLFL intervention, to have major restraint on vehicles through a congestion charge and parking controls, and that's now then been taken forward. The last couple of slides I had really were about the fact that traffic in towns can be seen to justify different things. And in one respect, the minister at the time, Ernest Marples, he was actually a road builder by profession. And he was quite clear that the town accepts the motor vehicle as a brilliant and beneficial intervention. It shouldn't restrict the motor car. And we want to build new towns. But that was his personal take on it. And I'm pretty sure that Sir Colin didn't see it that way. And you can see from Rishi Sunak, he wants to push on for the political benefits, as he sees it, that the driver voters that he wants to impress. So Colin, on the other hand, definitely saw it about restraint. He was involved in a very famous case in Croxford, where there was actually an approved road across Christchurch Meadow, and he came to that inquiry, and he forced them to reconsider that point by saying that his whole research report was about restraint. So it could be seen to be different things to different people. But really, my conclusion, I guess, is that there were many great things about the research, and it was very clear that they pointed out the unacceptability of catering fully for the car, and showed how different options could offer alternatives. But perhaps to me, their biggest sort of thing they could have changed was their starting assumption of providing as much vehicle access as the environment could allow probably went too far, and has been used by some to justify inappropriate measures. On the other hand, many people, such as Oxford and York and others, have also used the research to justify traffic restraint and a better environment. As Andreas said, it's really striking that a publication 60 years ago could have foretold so accurately the issues and opportunities created by the motor vehicle, and offered society a set of pathways or options to deal with it. And I think we still have much to learn from its application. I think my final slide really is a little bit about the future. We're still battling to reconcile transport and environment, and the car will be with us for decades to come. But large cities like London and towns like Oxford and York, and perhaps even smaller settlements, are showing that it's a fantastic living environment that really trumps full vehicle access. Indeed, as Sir Colin and his team put it, we really want towns worth living in their broadest sense. Thank you very much. That's the end of it.
Athol, thank you very much, and thank you to Peter and Andreas for their presentation. So we've got lots of great questions in the Q&A in the chat. Let me just start myself by asking the three of you. So do you think the crux of the issue about the Buchanan report was it was a great report that's been either misinterpreted or badly implemented? Or do you think that there were some fundamental flaws, to your point, Athol, about infrastructure heavy, starting from the point of view of accommodating demand if possible, not thinking about the politics as well as the science? So is this a great report, badly implemented, or ultimately a report that was flawed? Peter, let me start with you, since you began with your historical perspective, and I'll come to Andreas and Athol. Peter, what's your view?
Well, as was said, there are so many different aspects covered there, actually, that in a sense you can pick and choose. I think in the round, the fact that trying to forewarn people that cars will grow and will come to dominate cities if we don't do anything, I think was helpful, if not taken up sufficiently. But I think I agree with Athol in a way that the presumption was, how much car use can we accommodate environmentally and whatever. And I think that's not the approach we take now. I think we go beyond that and say, how would we like life in our cities to be? And it's not so much about moving around metal boxes, it's enabling people to travel around, and what are the best ways of doing that? So, but a lot of insights, it did bring together traffic and planning and architecture in a way we haven't really done since. A lot of good stuff in there about environmental areas and so on. A warning that in larger places you can never fully accommodate the car. But I think I would agree that in a sense it did start from more from a presumption that we were going to accommodate cars as much as we could. Having said that, we were still in a post-war period where there were lots of bomb sites and things, and the idea of comprehensive redevelopment was sort of more within the mindset at that time. Thank you.
Badly implemented or sort of flawed at its heart? I think I can guess your answer.
Well, you know, sorry, talking to Athol now.
No, oh, sorry, yeah, no, sorry, Andreas and then Athol.
Andreas, sorry, yeah.
I would not have a bad word said about traffic in towns. No, seriously, I still believe it was an excellent report. It raised all the big issues. It had a worldwide impact. I remember when I was working for Colin Buchanan and Partners, we would get telephone calls from Shanghai or, you know, the Caribbean, and people saying to us, "Can you come and do a land use planning study for us?" You know, it made a big impact, and it made people think, and it made people want to find answers. I think that was its biggest legacy, if you like. Of course, it got a number of things wrong. You know, we are talking 60 years ago, different word, different perceptions, etc. I think my personal view is that the greatest mistake probably that they made was that picture which both Athol and Peter had shown, where they said, okay, we can handle the traffic on Tottenham Court Road in London. Let's put the pedestrians on a different level, and that illustrates the problem of misrepresentation as well. We see that in so many different cities around the world now. You know, Hong Kong, Japan, even the Barbican here in London. That's exactly what they did. And it's exactly the reverse to what we are trying to do now. Now we are talking about shared space, whatever that means. You know, we are talking, let's get pedestrians and vehicles together. Let's give the better dominance to pedestrians, calm the traffic down, get them all together rather than separate them. Apart from that, I think all the other, I can't see of anything else that the report got wrong. It's just that we either ignored, as I said in my introduction, or misrepresented some of its recommendations.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, from my point of view, although I kind of pointed out some sort of possible things that he could have done differently, you know, from a personal point of view, I think it's a fantastic report. You know, if I look around now and what the things we're considering, every single one was identified by them 60 years ago, apart from climate change, which at that time wasn't really a scientific, you know, thing connected with vehicles. But everything else, even from out of town shopping centers to competition with town centers, everything's in that report. And so from that point of view, I think they clearly thought it well through, and they gave us all a multidisciplinary basis upon which to work. And don't forget, their key objective was to show society the way, the different options that you could use with the car. And they pointed out that the motor vehicle is very political. And in the end, society has to make a choice. The politicians and the people who vote for them have to make a choice as to what kind of towns they wish to live in. A town that is very highly accessible by car, but a booming economy in the context that Peter was describing the context. You know, they were predicting a doubling of traffic in 10 years and a trebling in 20. I mean, that puts what we deal with, you know, completely out of context. You know, that was really what was happening at the time. And so they were giving society the choices and saying, these are the consequences. I don't think they were saying in any particular way, you must go down this road. But they perhaps could have been a slightly more emphasis on the demand restraint side of things, which they identified. They identified road pricing, they identified public transport, they identified parking as being a key issue. So all those things really, I don't think it was wrong. I think it was used in different ways in different places, and it is really a fantastic report. I do really respect them for their intellectual abilities and the way they went about their job. We've run through it very quickly. A lot of time and effort went into those different options that they went into. Thanks.
Great, Athol. So some great questions in the chat and the Q&A. Just a couple of questions on freight. One saying, was the report freight blind to supply chain logistics issues, which to some extent is still the case now in some parts of the country? And then similarly, what can we say anything more about sort of how freight and goods traffic were dealt with in the report? Peter, what's your sense? I don't know how well you sort of know the specifics of it, but what's your sense of how well the report dealt with issues around freight and logistics supporting the economic activities in towns and cities as well as the sort of human activity?
I haven't read all 200 pages. Again, I skim read them, but I don't think freight as such appears very much, although in environmental areas, there is a recognition that those do need to be serviced so that there will be deliveries and so on in those areas. But it's certainly, I don't think, and Athol or Andreas will know better, I don't think it was highlighted very much in the report as much. It was more about flood of traffic.
Peter, sorry, I think it was actually. So right in the start of the report, they pointed out that the growth of freight was perhaps one of the biggest demands for motor vehicles. And so that they were very cognizant of the fact that there was a tremendous growth in the use of freight and the sheer door-to-door accessibility of freight, which the motor vehicle was bringing. So there was a big emphasis on it as an economic driver behind the motor vehicle's importance. And as you point out, the fact that it was regarded as a kind of like an essential motor vehicle use. So if they were doing a hierarchy of use, they would put the freight as kind of one of the higher essential items. But they didn't spend a chapter on freight or anything like that, but they did highlight its importance and the fact that these core areas like Norwich city centre still had to have deliveries of a kind, and it needed to be tamed. The car needed to be tamed, I guess, was a kind of a expression that often he used to use. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then just one final question in this section. I guess a key question, given the focus on infrastructure provision, to what extent was the notion of induced demand for traffic understood at the time of the report? I.e., if you create the infrastructure, particularly sort of major highway capacity, you will actually generate the demand that you've already forecast. Peter, to what extent do you think that was a piece of knowledge around at the time and which has since caught up with us?
Well, again, I defer to Andreas and Athol, really. I don't think so. I mean, the focus is very much on car ownership and within urban areas, the extent to which it would be possible to accommodate people's perceived desires to want to use cars once they own them. I don't think there was a sense.
You're right.
Because it didn't really focus on intra-urban areas or longer trips. It was really looking at more local trips, I think.
Yeah, Andreas, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I don't think the term induced traffic did not enter our vocabulary until the 80s. So, but even without that particular terminology, they were correct in forecasting, as Athol and Peter have already said, the level of traffic growth that there would be in this country. But there was no direct reference, as far as I can remember, in the report about induced traffic.
Once again, I think that's being a little bit harsh on them. They definitely talked about the constraining effect of capacity. In other words, there was no capacity, therefore the peak hour would expand and people couldn't get through. But they also talked about the fact that if left unfettered, extra capacity would generate more traffic. And they pointed to the United States, where so much capacity had been provided and even more was demanded. So it wasn't as clear as it perhaps is now, but that they definitely did mention it in their discussions. And they also pointed out that land use and transport were very, very closely linked. But yeah, it was discussed, but perhaps less so than we would do now.
Great. Thank you all very much indeed. So we'll come back to you a bit later on for some further questions and comments. So let's move on now to a kind of forward look, if you like. What relevance does the Buchanan report have for us now? What can it suggest about what we should be thinking about in terms of our current urban transport and traffic policy? So to start that part of the conversation, I'm very pleased to invite Deborah Payton from Glasgow City Council to give a view from a specific city point of view on how Buchanan looks now 60 years on. Deborah.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Deborah Payton, and I'm Head of Transport Planning and Delivery within Glasgow City Council. To respond to Andreas's challenge, first of all, I wouldn't define myself as a polymath, but I am both an urban planner by training and a transport planner as well. So there's a couple of the key elements of the Buchanan report thrown in there. So from my perspective, overall, the Buchanan report is still very relevant to many of the challenges cities and indeed other areas face today. And we've had a really good discussion about the pros and cons of that. But I think that seems to be the overwhelming conclusion from the chat today so far. In Glasgow, we've been updating our suite of sustainable transport policies over the last couple of years, which again responds to that Buchanan report element on the need for a strong policy structure, national policy, then regional plans, then more detailed plans at a local level for specific areas. We have a new Glasgow transport strategy, and we spent a lot of time getting some key policies in place in our policy framework, which was adopted last year. We're now doing a spatial delivery framework, which is the spatial response to those policies. And at some point in the future, if we manage to get some funding, I would be keen to do a circulation plan, which again responds to some of the elements in the Buchanan report, because an efficient use of the road network has been identified from our transport appraisal work as really key, and that includes road space reallocation, which I'll talk a bit more about because that's a key challenge, as well as shortening journeys and reducing the need to travel overall. And those are all elements that Transport Scotland's national research on decarbonising transport have also identified as crucial in that, and they link very well to Buchanan report themes. But crucially, we have done a lot of analysis of travel demand, and we have forecast travel demand in all the appraisal and strategy work that we've done. And I know the audience here today will all be well versed in that. But we are trying to influence that demand and the modal choices, which I do think the Buchanan report advocates to an extent, although Peter and Athol have obviously referenced the Buchanan report element of planning for as much car traffic as possible. So we have been planning networks, and the Buchanan report advocated that. So though maybe perhaps more of a focus on traffic networks in that report that I have to flag up. I have not read the whole thing. I have read highlights, but we're also focusing within that network development on how we reallocate road space. And that really is a key challenge for us now for cities and urban areas everywhere, how to retrofit space essentially. And I guess that is something that the Buchanan report kind of foresaw. There is also only a small amount of the environment that can be changed through new development, so hence that retrofit piece is really important. The Buchanan report asks for comprehensive redevelopment, feels quite large in scale, and as has been noted today, a lot of emphasis on infrastructure and road infrastructure. And potentially that is quite challenging within the systems that we have. We have a development-led planning system in the UK, but we're doing what we can in Glasgow via master plans, via our city development plan, and underneath that we have various levels of development frameworks as well. We also have a strong work stream on livable neighbourhoods, which is essentially co-design with communities to try and shape the environments that local people want to see. We are planning cycling networks, and we now have a full city network planned, and that's on our website for Active Travel. We're also looking at bus network planning. But how we control and influence that is also challenging, and the Buchanan report did flag up governance as key to change as well. And I was interested in the question about freight because there are a few bits of the report that does mention planning for goods in transport plans as well. So we're also considering freight distribution hubs and mobility hubs for the kind of last mile delivery piece at the minute within our transport strategy work. And another key element of our road space reallocation work is that we've developed a street space reallocation framework with some principles around that, about where space is constrained, network planning, and trying to come up with some principles about how to make decisions on how that space is used. Though ultimately everything will come down to design and community engagement. And I think that community engagement bit also links to another major aspect of the Buchanan report, the role of the public, their views and their engagement in change. And crucially, recognising the role of the car and its impact. The behaviour change piece is huge and potentially almost more important now than it has been in a long time, I would argue. And I feel like we still need more of that awareness raising at a national level on the impact of traffic in our communities, on the environment and our health. As practitioners, professionals, we're all very well versed in it, but I do wonder how much the general public are really aware of some of these things. But fundamentally, the car is convenient, and that is which Buchanan report foresaw. And we are still struggling with the battle of that convenience and the status of having a car influencing travel choice. And we're all human. Human beings tend to avoid things that cause them pain or discomfort. So these are all very natural sort of human decisions that people are making. We try to engage the public as much as possible in everything that we do. We had a public conversation on Glasgow's Transport Future in 2020. It was a very successful engagement exercise, despite being in 2020. We work in co-design in our livable neighbourhoods work, and of course we do detailed consultation within our sustainable transport projects. But there is that interesting commentary in the Buchanan report that predicted governments of the future would be heavily influenced by car owners. And of course, we plan for and serve all citizens. In Glasgow, though, we are very conscious that we have large parts of the city where most households don't have access to a car at all. Just a few more points I wanted to flag up that are relevant to our work. The fundamental linkage of buildings and traffic absolutely still holds true today, and it's the basis of integrated land use and transport planning that many of us have been advocating throughout our careers, as well as protecting communities from the excessive impacts of too much traffic. That's also the basis, those points are also the basis of the concept 20-minute neighbourhoods, which are about trying to facilitate resident access to more local services and facilities in their local areas so that they can choose to walk, cycle, wheel to them, use public transport, and fundamentally reducing the impact of travel in their local areas. Impacts well documented, and to create safer, more pleasant and livable environments. But that's not to say that the car won't still continue to have a role for many and for many trips, and people can absolutely travel wherever they want. But it's about less trips by traffic and reducing those traffic impacts on communities, which the report, the Buchanan report, talked about a lot. And it's also about addressing that imbalance that has been created over the years by planning for motor traffic, which is what the Buchanan report forecast. And a fundamental conclusion of the Buchanan report that still holds true for how we're approaching our work in Glasgow. It's not just one solution, but it's a combination of lots of things. And also better alternatives. It mentions public transport. I'm not sure that maybe the others can validate this, but I'm not sure it really majors on active travel, particularly cycling, but maybe there's other bits in the report where it talks about that at length. But it does also talk about parking policy is key, and that is something that we've been working hard to get our parking policies in shape. There is an interesting quote in the report that says parking on the highway should be zealously safeguarded by the public authority, and that's something for us all to take note. And we have policies in place now to try and address this imbalance. An inefficient use of how some public space is used is also crucial for reallocating space to buses, to cycling, to footways, to local placemaking and space for businesses. The Connectivity Commission for Glasgow also highlighted the importance of governance to progress, and I understand Transport Scotland are continuing to do a review of transport governance related to the National Transport Strategy. And we're also continuing to explore some of the bus governance options set out in the 2019 Transport Scotland Act. And the Buchanan report also did touch on some of those, and interestingly about vested interests in the conclusions as well. So in conclusion, I think it's still highly relevant and some very positive, proactive messaging in there that we can all build on. And arguably, transport planners, we're all just only starting to tackle some of the elements that it forecast and advocated. So perhaps we need to come back in another 60 years and see how we go on.
Deborah, thank you very much. So you've touched on linking land use planning and transport, the importance of community engagement in thinking about these complex questions, the critical role of thinking about behaviour change as well as infrastructure design, the challenge around retrofit, and parking, a whole lot of other issues. One question from me to you. I mean, you mentioned, as have others, the kind of politics. This is about human beings and their current sort of behaviours and aspirations. How are the politics of this in Glasgow in terms of changing how the city operates in terms of allocation of space, priority given to different forms of travel? How's that playing out politically?
Politically in Glasgow, we're very fortunate that we have strong political support for sustainable transport and many of the interventions that we need to do in that. And I would say that's reflected by arguably strong public support. We have had good responses to consultations. Our Spaces for People programme, for example, which was the programme that was put in place after with some COVID-19 funding to reallocate more space for buses, for walking and cycling. That was largely made permanent, and people were consulted on decisions to do that. I think Glasgow has a lot of road space. It has, as I mentioned, it has substantial proportions of households without access to a car. So I would hope that we are, people are on board with this, and ultimately we are here to serve essentially what people want. But I think the background context at a UK level is challenging, as we can see, and some of the messaging, yes, is problematic.
Masterful understatement, if I may say so. Thank you very much. Great, Deborah, thank you very much. We'll come back to you with further questions in a minute. Isabel, finally, Isabel Dedring from Arup. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A around international examples. Hong Kong, Bordeaux, both mentioned where some of the principles in Buchanan have been implemented and by implication not entirely successfully in terms of segregation of different forms of travel on different levels. What's your sense of the international perspective on Buchanan as we look forward to the next 60 years?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and thanks for letting me be part of this. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Isabel Dedring, and I look after the transport business at Arup. For those of you who don't know Arup, we're an employee-owned trust based in the UK, and we've now got 19,000 people around the world in 90 disciplines. So for those of you who don't know us, come find out a bit more. Obviously, the world is a big place, so we could probably choose, hundreds of places to look at, and I've got 9.5 minutes left. So I've just picked 5 locations for us to dip into, which are quite different and might, kind of lead to prompt some interesting discussions, some of which refer to comments people were making in the chat already. So the first place that I thought we could look at was the United States. Now, others will know far more about this than I do, but Colin went to the States in 1962 as part of his research for traffic in towns. And of course, the States is well known for, having an extensive motorway network, probably far too extensive. And there have been a few, since the 1960s. Now we're kind of, 50, 60 years on, some headline projects like putting the Presidio Parkway underground in San Francisco, which is shown in this image. But it's worth really flagging that since that time, there's now a real upswelling of interest in continuing to tackle the consequences of the motorway building program in the United States in the last century. And just a few examples. This is the I-5 in Portland, which was a classic example where motorway construction was used as a device to separate and indeed segregate communities, racially disproportionately affecting Black communities. And there's now a big program across the states, partly aided by the Biden legislation, which is investing in infrastructure to kind of restore communities, and kind of a little bit linked to some of the comments in the chat, I would say very driven by a social equity agenda specifically. So this is just an example of a project where the intention is to basically reconnect the community and what's called restore the grid across the motorway. Another example, Indianapolis, downtown, partial, capping and restoration. And this is kind of across the country. You're seeing these projects coming forward on quite a significant scale, really exciting and interesting work that's happening. And interestingly, if you come back to the UK for a moment, if you look at the A13 and Barking and Dagenham, very similar major motorway, air pollution issues, segregating a poor community. You know, there have been proposals over time to deck it and put 10 to 30,000 homes on top, create a park. But in this country, we continue to be very uncomfortable with the idea of tunneling large roads. You know, isn't that just building more roads, et cetera? So there's a really interesting disconnect between the UK and where we are on these sorts of ideas and the US. The other aspect in the US is how do we repurpose the roads that exist? So not just putting them underground, you know, changing the levels, reconnecting. And just two examples, this is the Lower Hudson Transit Link in New York, where rather than just building a bridge with a load of cars on it, it's a multimodal corridor that's been very carefully designed with kind of mode shift in mind. And a project that hasn't yet happened, probably will never happen, but we did some work with big architects on how you could rethink the Brooklyn Bridge to make it much more about multimodal corridors. So there's a whole kind of thread in the States around that as well, which is that kind of conversion of existing assets. So that's the kind of, you know, picture in the US. Then moving to a completely different part of the world, and Cleo was making some comments in the chat which are helpful about Hong Kong. So I would say the picture, if we look at Hong Kong, really what I wanted to highlight was that, you know, the cultural context, the urban context, the economic context is very different in different places, as we know. And this image somewhat highlights the fact that there's different tolerance of the idea of motorways in the center of cities, and yet there's still green space kind of woven within it. In the Hong Kong context, where are things at the moment? There's a major push to connect Hong Kong, which is in the lower part of the screen there for people who don't know, sort of outward into the Greater Bay Area, including the creation of the Northern Metropolis, which eventually will house up to a third of the city's population, and to create connections, you know, beyond Hong Kong and into mainland China. And so as part of this, there's a major road building program, as well as a railway program, et cetera, as we look to 2035 and beyond. And this is just some examples. So there, what you're seeing is an economically driven motivation to really build significant further roads that, you know, from a Buchanan standpoint, would that be good? Would it not? You know, I think kind of depends on how it's executed. And I've just put in an extra page here based on Cleo's point in the chat there, which is the new towns, which are an attempt to kind of, with the grain of Hong Kong, but also bringing in that, you know, segregated approach. You know, has it worked? Has it not? But this just hopefully illustrates the point that Cleo was making there. So I would say there, you know, there's a major road building program in a major metropolis, but very much driven by an economic agenda. And how does that actually work at the finer grain of the city? I think still hasn't quite been worked out, but that's partly because culturally there's just a kind of, you know, complete habituation to, you know, big roads, but also parks, and it's all kind of layered together. And, you know, interesting, could that have happened in a London context if a kind of different scenario set out in that Fitzrovia picture earlier could have played out in the London context potentially, which would have given us in some aspects what, you know, Hong Kong has now. Third place I wanted to go to was Singapore. I don't think this is looking right, but so this is an existing roadway called the North-South Corridor, and there we go. And, you know, pretty standard big motorway through the city. And this is a program that we're involved in to repurpose the corridor completely. What I thought was interesting about this was this is still focused on repurposing existing footprints, but the concept is very much based around nature, no cars at all. The idea is that it would be very much public transport and all AVs. And lots of active travel. So here you're seeing a level of ambition maybe that's much higher than perhaps many cities are prepared to look at. And for me, there's some really fascinating elements here around nature, as well as around using future technology in a much more assertive way than most cities are prepared to do, which is looking at technology sort of, you know, somewhere on the fringes of, you know, maybe we'll use it over here in the corner somewhere. So there, I would say this is a kind of much bolder idea about that American repurposing notion and is taking it to a much further extent. And this is seen as a major test of, this idea, if we can get it to work on this corridor, could it be relevant more extensively within Singapore? And building on that, and kind of take this even further into a greenfield type context, which of course most of us on this call don't have the luxury of looking at a greenfield type setting. Indonesia is looking to move its capital city, so it's a greenfield site. And I'm just going to say this is a 1-minute video that hopefully you can see. There's no sound, so basically this is just showing what the new city would look like. And here, starting to kind of take some of the principles in the Buchanan report, how might you play those out in a completely greenfield environment? And so what it's looking to do is to design from first principles around a 10-minute walk from the LRT, so that you're almost thinking about there's no roads at all, right? The entire network is built around the LRT system. And then you have these smaller hubs which use basically micromobility, AVs, electric scooters, et cetera, as a way of getting to and from the LRT nodes. So might that be, a kind of ultimately where we end up? How much of that obviously can you do outside of a greenfield environment? Question mark. Some of what Barcelona is doing is probably, analogous here with the super blocks that they're building. But obviously, wouldn't we all like to live in a place that looks like this? If, the real world looked a bit more like CGI. So I thought that was almost, you could sort of dream a little bit further. The last point I was going to raise was coming back a little bit closer to home in terms of Buchanan himself again. One of the places that he went to was Auckland, and he worked in Auckland to review what the plan was then. That was already confirmed that the plan was to build the bypass that you can see here, and there, in the sort of top part of the slide, the city center. And he basically did a review of, right, okay, you've decided to do this. This is your plan. Is it going to work or not? And what's interesting about, and I read through the report yesterday just to take a look at what he said. Extremely well written as well. And one of the guys who dug it out said it was very well hidden in the Auckland City Archives. So obviously, nobody really wants it to be found. But decades ago, basically the advice Auckland has ignored for 50 years, but must now heed. So the working assumption was that Queen Street needs to be pedestrianized. We need to reduce car movement and focus on increasing public transport movement. So decades later, what's actually happening is, a proposal for a light rail scheme, as he correctly suggested decades ago. And if not the pedestrianization of Queen Street, the, significant reduction in traffic and improvement in the quality of the environment on the street. So what's interesting to me is with a lot of these things, yes, we can, think about what a totally greenfield interpretation of Buchanan might lead us towards. But to some extent, we know what we need to do. And this is just about doing the things that we all knew about decades ago, and just having the political bravery, as you were saying there, Ben, to actually just put in place what isn't necessarily very complicated. It's just having the guts to go ahead and do it. So that's kind of bringing it slightly back to earth from the kind of greenfield Indonesia setting, and coming back to a setting that might be a little bit more familiar to many of us. And how do we start to just bring in some of the things that we all know we need to do into the settings that we're working in day to day? So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour around 5 places around the world that might create a bit of, might be a bit thought-provoking for our Q&A.
Isabel, thank you very much indeed. So one question for me. So you obviously pointed out that the context in which these plans and schemes are being delivered and executed are very different, but to what extent are you detecting a kind of consensus around how we should manage traffic in town 60 years on from Buchanan? Because I mean, several examples there of reallocating highway space, repurposing existing infrastructure, but some examples of quite Buchanan-like grade separated infrastructure. To what extent is there a sort of a kind of global shared view on how we should manage traffic in town 6 years on from the original report?
It's an interesting question. That was what I was trying to illustrate a bit with the Hong Kong example, and indeed Singapore to some extent. I would say there really isn't a consensus at the moment at all, and different contexts are seen quite differently. Having said that, I would say I've seen a quite big uptick in interest in the last even 18 months or 2 years in a whole suite of things around kind of road pricing, low emission zones, et cetera, in urban contexts. And there's much more interest, that isn't sort of conceptual or theoretical in actually bringing some of these things in. So in terms of policy interventions, rather than consensus around the physical infrastructure, I would say there is a stronger upswell in that. And then the other thing is there's definitely a bigger interest or need to be interested in from a political perspective in all the questions around social equity. Can people access what they need to access, which goes a bit to the Shatin example that Cleo was raising there in the chat. But also, what is the impact in terms of dividing communities, et cetera. It wasn't really a big topic, I would say 10, 20 years ago in the industry. Transport's great, be grateful, be happy that you've got it, right? And now there's a recognition that isn't maybe an adequate answer. So that's the other area where I think there's more consistency, I would say, globally, as far as I see it.
Great, thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes for further questions and comments. There's a really interesting question in the chat, actually. Andreas, I think you mentioned that Colin Buchanan was a polymath and that the report covered a kind of broad set of issues around urban design, transport engineering. I'd just be interested in the panel's views on skills. And Deborah pointed out that she's an urban designer and a planner. What if we're going to deal with the complex challenge of managing traffic in towns successfully? What sort of skills do we think we need? Do we need more polymaths? How do we create polymaths so that we're not kind of in our professional and technical silos? Andreas, you mentioned the fact that Colin Buchanan himself was a polymath. What's your view on the skills that we need to deal with this?
I was talking to Professor Nick Tyler a few months ago, who said to me, we're going to do a new master's course in transport planning at UCL. What do you think we should include on this course? And my answer to him was anything other than highway engineering. So you need to teach people how to think about the environment. You need to teach them about future technologies. So they knew professional dealing with building communities, because I wouldn't like to leave it to just highways. We are building communities. Needs to be a polymath, in my view. Not only that, but the different professions, the architects, the engineers, the economists, the urban designers need to be working together. I was in Utrecht a few years ago as part of a delegation from the Academy of Urbanism, and we were talking with the director of planning in Utrecht. He showed us his office and team, and it was a huge open space where everybody, from engineers to architects, they all work together as a team. It wasn't an individual department in one building, another. And I actually asked this gentleman, I said to him, in one word, what is your priority for the city of Utrecht? And he surprised me, because if I had asked the same question of any other director in a department in the UK, they would probably have said housing or traffic. He said health. Everything we do is about the health and well-being of our citizens. And any decision we take, we always ask the question, will this create healthier citizens? So if we start from that point, then we all need to be polymaths. It's not good enough to be a traffic engineer or an architect designing buildings. So we need to bring all of that together. And in order to do that, we need to change our priorities. What are our priorities? Is it to facilitate the car, or have we got, as a society, have we got some other priorities these days? And I think we should do that. We should change our priorities, and it goes back to the values that we all cherish.
Great, thank you. And Deborah, you're kind of in the front line of this. You're thinking about how to reshape Glasgow for health and other reasons, and in terms of economic development and to tackle social exclusion. To what extent have you got access to the skills that, I don't mean you personally, but you as a sort of manager of these processes, the skills that you need, and what additional skills do you think we need to provide you with from the universities and from the technical training that we provide to professionals in this sector?
Well, we're fortunate in terms of our teams, very well skilled and diverse. I suppose the points I would make in response to this question, because I do think it's a very important question, is first that we need more diversity, I think, in backgrounds of people working on these issues, whether that's within local government or consultancies or academia. It's probably fair to say there's been a certain sort of demographic potentially that's worked on these issues over the years. And from an agile leadership and agile management perspective, that diversity of experience and life experience is really important to bring to bear when you're talking about projects that are fundamentally about reshaping local environments. The second point that I would make is just about the people skills side of things. So clearly we do absolutely need engineers, we need transport planners, we need urban planners, we need all of these things, these technical skills. But I think increasingly the big challenge is engaging with people and having open discussions, engaging with people, narratives, discussing things in a way that they will understand, that they'll be able to connect to. And that's quite a hard skill set to have amongst all the other skills that we need as well. So I would just stress that point too.
Great.
I was just going to comment, Ben, on what Deborah was just saying there, because I think having worked in a political context, Ben and I used to work together, I think there's often a view within the profession that that's a political issue that politicians need to deal with, right? That go out and engage with the public, go sell them that thing, that brilliant thing that I designed. And actually, all of us understanding and engaging with what needs to happen in the political process for something to happen, whether that's building a piece of infrastructure or whether, as some people are saying in the chat, right, it's a policy-driven, thing that we need to put in place. All of it will not happen without, getting through the political process in some form or another. So building our kind of embracing that rather than trying to separate it, I think is fundamental for all of us in our professional lives. It's understanding that, that we take ownership of that, not kind of farm it out to politicians.
Yeah, great. So I'd like to come back to infrastructure. There's quite a few comments and questions in the chat about infrastructure. So Graham Jones points out that massive infrastructure investments in consequential urban development was part of the spirit of the age at the time of the Buchanan report, whereas today is more about muddling through with congestion, equality, livability issues, and other questions and comments further on about sort of the focus on infrastructure planning in transport planning and urban design. Isabel, you talked about the fact that in Hong Kong there's an approach which kind of integrates major infrastructure with green space. To what extent have we got the balance right, do you think, either in the UK or globally, between infrastructure investment and other issues like behaviour change, repurposing existing infrastructure? Because obviously lots of money in new infrastructure, lots of design and build contracts to go after. From a global consultancy point of view, to what extent are we getting that balance right between infrastructure and other things we need to do?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think as an industry, I would say in transport, we fetishize, large infrastructure projects, right? It's like because you picture of the bridge that you did and it's on your wall and that isn't right. The dominance of infrastructure isn't right within the industry. Having said that, it's got a big role to play, right? Because if you want to connect two communities across a river, there's only kind of probably a couple of ways to do that, and policy isn't going to solve it. But that needs rebalancing, and I think that comes back to the skills issue as well, right? It's bringing in it's bringing the right skill set, but it's starting from the user, which I would say historically, again, we've been very solution led rather than outcome led. And so I think some of the people in the chat on behavior change, psychology, that kind of those skill sets that enable what do people actually need, and let's work backwards from that. within which the solution will no doubt include some infrastructure interventions, some of which might be quite significant. So our whole industry set up the wrong direction in the telescope. But I think we can all start, that's a hard problem to solve. But we can all start by always asking, what's the outcome that we want here and what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And then question whether we've got the right answer in the first place.
Great. And Peter, but both the kind of skills question and also this infrastructure question, you're involved in educating and training transport planners and others. What's your sense about those two issues? One is skills. Have we got the skills we need, and are we developing them? And secondly, have we got the right emphasis on non-infrastructure planning skills as part of this approach to traffic in towns?
Yeah, I think if you look over time, if you look back 40 or 50 years, transport has broadened its understanding of what it thinks it's about. And you can see within universities, the early departments were engineering departments, 1 or 2 geography departments, and then some planning departments got involved. Psychology, economists got involved, and then more recently, sociologists got involved, lots of work on mobility. So I think there's been a recognition within universities that there is a much wider range of disciplines that have an important part to play in the city. Can I make one other point? I'm just reflecting on our discussions. I mean, Buchanan very much, I mean, if I was picking out a word, or I guess the word traffic and the word environment would probably come out as the key words in a way. And I think he saw those as in a contradiction to some extent. And as I think Athol pointed out, he had this analogy of rooms and corridors, that essentially the corridors were for movement around to activities in the different rooms. And that's where his environmental areas come in. And I think the big difference now is that we don't really see that. I mean, Isabel's examples that look very impressive in Alton, they weren't about saying this street is for movement or it is for environment, which is like what we'd call place now. It's actually both. And I think that's the difference now. We're not trying to separate roads that deal with movement from those that deal with place, particularly in cities. We're trying to actually find a design balance that brings those two together at a level of traffic that makes it manageable. And just to go back to your point, what was interesting, we've done work with local authorities in London, including Hounslow. And when we've got together to talk about the movement function of streets, all the different players know each other already. When we talk about the place or destination functions of streets, the urban designers, the economic developers, development control people, they've probably never spoken to each other before. And I think that's the thing where we need on the destination or place side to actually have a composite understanding and bringing together of people there to inject that into our talking about urban streets. So we're not just dominated by movement considerations. Thank you.
Fantastic. We've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to finish by asking each of you in turn a slightly unfair question, and I'll go in reverse order from the presentations, which is, do we need Buchanan 2.0 in 2023, 60 years on from the original report, or do we know enough about from both Buchanan and work that's been done subsequently about the challenges and the solutions that we don't need to commission another major review of this sort? Isabel, you and I were involved with the Roads Task Force in London, which was sort of analogous, I guess, at a London scale, thinking about the role of the road network in a city. But do you think we need a major national report like Buchanan to take us through the next 60 years?
I think it would be a great idea. And it's not because any of the stuff in the original report is wrong. It's kind of precisely because it's right. It would be helpful to refresh it, because often we think, well, we haven't got anywhere with some of these arguments. Yeah, but the surrounding environment changes. And therefore, the ability of those arguments to have impact changes. But the other thing is that these wider considerations around the pressures on decarbonization, sustainable development, equitable development, and also the availability of new technology means that actually there's some quite new elements that are coming in which can help solve some of these problems. And that's where the Indonesia and Singapore examples are quite interesting, because they're really looking to leverage all aspects of new technology. And actually Hong Kong's doing a transport strategy as well at the moment that's looking at that. So actually there's some other levers that have come into the system and some other pressures from a political standpoint that I think would give a different answer that's an evolved answer building on the original report. So yeah, let's do it. Brilliant.
Okay, we'll set it up straight away. Deborah, what's your view from a Glasgow point of view? Do we need Buchanan 2.0?
Well, I wouldn't say from a Glasgow City point of view, from my personal and professional perspective, I'm a little bit torn, I'll be honest with you, because I feel that we know the things that we need to do, and lots of things have been well documented. We understand the impacts maybe it's a little disaggregated. There's reports on how to decarbonize transport. There's reports on, how to make areas more livable, all of that, and maybe it needs brought together. But in one sense, I can see the argument for it, but it would have to offer something new and fresh, I think, rather than just a rehash. So I confess, and I'm sorry, Peter, I'm torn.
That's fine. An ambiguous answer is great. Athol, what's your view? Do you need Buchanan too?
Yes, Ben, I think it would be a good idea. I think I agree with there is a lot out there that is available, but I think actually putting it together in a new composite form without going into a lot of detail, I think it has to be relatively short and sweet, but looking at the principles and how they've moved on since then would be really interesting idea. Really, I think it would be.
Great, thank you, Andreas. You're a big fan of the original report. Do you think we need to update it, produce a new version of it for the 21st century?
I don't often disagree with Athol. People will think it foolish of me, but in this instance, I do. I don't think we need another traffic in towns report, because that would be asking the wrong question. It's not about traffic. It's about the communities and places that we want to create. And therefore, the question must be that, rather than what are we going to do about traffic? Traffic is just an element of the world that we are building. So it would be wasteful to do another traffic in towns report. We should be doing one about the values and the communities that we want to build.
Brilliant, thank you. Finally, and lastly but not leastly, Peter, you started us off with the historic perspective. What's your sense of whether the time is right for a new report?
I think some taking stock would be valuable. I agree, it wouldn't be on the same scale. And this went on for years and had huge budget. I don't ever get back to that situation again. And I agree, we wouldn't really call it traffic in towns, moving in towns or living in towns or something like that. It might be more appropriate. But as Deborah said, there's a lot of stuff out there that's not really been brought together. It's not necessarily consistent. I mean, for example, a lot of the work on LTNs, in my mind, in some situations, potentially conflicts with the idea of 15-minute cities, where you're trying to promote high streets, which is the places where traffic gets displaced onto if you have residential LTN. So I think there are potential contradictions there. I think what might be valuable is if it was something national government would sort of take some degree of lead on, because although it's down to local authorities and cities, I think at the moment there is a disconnect between national policy and local policy. Nationally, we're talking about traffic growth. In cities, we're talking about traffic decline, or the extent to which cities need support from national government to really tackle decarbonisation and so on. So I think there could be merits in something, but a much lighter touch, I think. And with
very good
framing. Thank you.
So with the exception of Andreas, broadly speaking, yes, or at least some sort of synthesis of the stuff that's already out there, both internationally and nationally. So in the remaining minute, I'm not going to attempt the rash task of summarising what's been an absolutely fascinating discussion and set of presentations. Other than to say, first of all, I think the broad view is that the Buchanan report was an extraordinarily impressive document, very prescient, covered many of the issues that we're still confronting today, predicted what was going to happen if we didn't think about this properly, and presented some of the solutions that might be available to deal with those challenges. Secondly, a very clear theme, I think, about these days, we need to start from the outcomes we want from our transport system, including our road network, the social and economic and environmental outcomes, including in particular, obviously, dealing with the climate emergency, but also some really important issues around equity, thinking around the impact of traffic and its infrastructure on different communities, and which are sometimes very unequal in terms of the adverse consequences. And then thirdly, for me, some really interesting issues around the skills that we need, alongside the traditional skills of infrastructure design and engineering, and transport planning. So some skills around politics and how to engage properly with communities. Deborah stressed the importance of that engagement as part of this process. Psychological, neurological skills, and Isabel's point about working back from the user outcomes. What do people want from the transport system and the highway system to give us the social, economic, and environmental outcomes that we all want as we proceed in the 21st century? So it leaves me just to thank very much indeed our 5 presenters, Peter, Andreas, Athol, Deborah and Isabel, for the fascinating presentations and taking the questions and answers. Thank you very much to Brogan for organising the AV, And thank you very much to all of you for giving up your lunchtime for what I hope you'll agree has been a really, really interesting and stimulating debate. And I, for one, hope I'm back here in 6 years' time, slightly grey ahead, to discuss Buchanan 2 and whether that was the right report as well. Anyway, thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thanks,
all.
cheers. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.